in his hand when he was like 4 years old, making his own videos and stuff.
There are some Hollywood romances that disappear when the cameras stop rolling, and then there are the ones that refuse to disappear. For years, Dennis Quaid and Meg Ryan were remembered as one of Hollywood's most recognizable couples. They were young, successful, attractive, and seemingly perfect together. But behind the photographs, the premieres, and the smiling interviews was a marriage that eventually collapsed. Years passed, both moved on, both built new lives, and Dennis Quaid married 3 more times. Yet whenever his romantic history was discussed, one name continued to come up: Meg Ryan. So what really happened between them? Was Meg simply one chapter in Dennis Quaid's life? Or was she the woman who left a mark that no one who came after her could completely erase? To understand that story, we have to go back to the beginning. Chapter 1. Before Meg Ryan. Long before Dennis Quaid became known as one of Hollywood's familiar leading men, he was simply an ambitious young actor trying to establish himself. Born in Houston, Texas, Quaid grew up far away from the Hollywood spotlight. He eventually moved toward acting and began appearing in films during the 1970s. The road to stardom was not immediate. Like many actors, he spent years taking smaller roles and trying to prove that he belonged. But Quaid had something directors noticed. He could be charming without seeming completely polished. He could play a tough character, but he could also bring vulnerability to the screen. That combination would eventually make him a recognizable Hollywood star. And in 1978, another important chapter began. Dennis Quaid married actress PJ Soles. At the time, Quaid was still building his career. Their marriage lasted several years before ending in divorce in 1983. It was his first marriage, but it would certainly not be his last. Hollywood would eventually give Dennis Quaid enormous success. It would also give him relationships that would become far more complicated. And then, years later, he would meet the woman who would become the most famous wife of his life, Meg Ryan. Chapter 2. When Dennis Met Meg. By the late 1980s, both Dennis Quaid and Meg Ryan were becoming major stars. Ryan had established herself as one of America's most beloved actresses. Her performances gave her an image that was warm, funny, intelligent, and approachable. Quaid had a different screen persona. He could play the romantic lead, the troubled man, the athlete, the hero, or the complicated character. When they worked together on the film DOA, something changed. The two actors developed a relationship away from the cameras. Hollywood immediately became interested. Two successful young stars falling in love was exactly the kind of story the entertainment industry loved. But their relationship was not simply a publicity romance. They eventually married in 1991. For a time, Dennis Quaid and Meg Ryan represented Hollywood success. They were both famous, they were both working, and they had a child together. Their son, Jack Quaid, was born in 1992. For Dennis, becoming a father added another dimension to his life. For Meg, motherhood came while her own career was reaching another level. The couple seemed to have everything, but Hollywood relationships can look very different from the inside, and behind the glamorous image, problems were beginning to appear. Chapter 3. The marriage that Hollywood watched. Dennis Quaid and Meg Ryan became one of those celebrity couples whose private lives were constantly discussed in public. Their careers continued to grow. Ryan became one of the biggest romantic comedy stars of her generation. Films such as When Harry Met Sally, Sleepless in Seattle, and You've Got Mail made her an enormous star. Quaid also continued working steadily. But fame has a price. The more successful they became, the more attention their marriage received. Eventually, the relationship began to fall apart. Their marriage ended in divorce in 2001. For fans who had watched them together, the breakup was difficult to understand. But relationships are rarely as simple as they appear in photographs. Years later, both Quaid and Ryan would speak publicly about their marriage, and some of Quaid's comments would make people look at their relationship differently. In particular, Quaid acknowledged that their marriage had not been perfect, and that there were complicated circumstances surrounding their breakup. The details of their relationship became part of Hollywood history. But perhaps the most interesting part was what happened afterward. Dennis Quaid did not stop believing in marriage. Instead, he tried again, and again, and again. Chapter 4. After Meg. Following his divorce from Meg Ryan, Dennis Quaid entered a new chapter of his life. In 2004, he married Kimberly Buffington. This marriage lasted much longer than some people might expect. The couple eventually welcomed twins, Thomas Boone and Zoe Grace, in 2007. For years, Quaid's life looked very different from his years with Meg Ryan. He was older, his career had evolved, he was a father of 3, and he was building a family outside the Hollywood romance that had defined much of his earlier life. But the marriage eventually encountered serious problems. Quaid and Buffington separated and went through a complicated divorce process. Their marriage officially ended in 2018. By then, Dennis Quaid had experienced 2 very different high-profile marriages. His first marriage had ended decades earlier. His second had been with Meg Ryan, one of Hollywood's biggest stars. His third had produced twins and lasted for more than a decade. And then came his fourth marriage. Chapter 5. Laura Savoy. In 2020, Dennis Quaid married Laura Savoy. The relationship attracted attention partly because of their age difference, but Quaid has consistently presented their relationship as something genuine and meaningful. For him, this was another chance at a lasting partnership. At this stage of his life, Quaid was no longer the young actor who had married PJ Soles. He was no longer the Hollywood heartthrob who had married Meg Ryan. He was an older man who had experienced several relationships, divorce, fatherhood, career success, and the enormous pressure of living in the public eye. Laura became his fourth wife, and unlike the marriages that had ended before, this relationship represented a different period of his life. But there was one question that never completely disappeared. What about Meg? Chapter 6. The woman everyone remembers. When people discuss Dennis Quaid's marriages, they don't always remember the first one. They don't always focus on the third, and many people know little about the details of his fourth marriage. But Meg Ryan remains different. Their relationship happened during one of the most important periods of both their careers. They were young, they were famous, they had a child, and they were part of Hollywood's golden romantic comedy era. That combination created a lasting cultural memory. But there is another reason Meg Ryan continues to be discussed. Dennis Quaid has spoken about her with a level of warmth that has sometimes surprised people. He has acknowledged the love that existed between them. He has also discussed the problems that eventually affected their marriage, and over the years, both have reflected on the relationship from very different perspectives. That does not necessarily mean Quaid secretly wanted to return to Meg. It does not mean his later marriages were less meaningful. But it does show something important. Some relationships remain emotionally significant even after they are over, and Meg Ryan was clearly an important part of Dennis Quaid's life. Chapter 7. Did he love Meg more? This is where the story becomes more complicated. The headline sounds simple. Dennis Quaid finally reveals that Meg Ryan was the love of his life. But reality is rarely that simple. There is no reason to turn a complicated relationship into a fairy tale. Dennis Quaid married 4 women. Each marriage represented a different period of his life. PJ Soles was part of his early years. Meg Ryan was part of his rise into major Hollywood stardom. Kimberly Buffington shared more than a decade of his life and became the mother of his twins. Laura Savoy became his fourth wife during a completely different stage of adulthood. So, saying that one woman was automatically more important than the others would oversimplify his life. But there is still a reason people ask the question. Meg Ryan was different. She was the woman connected to a specific era of his career. She was the mother of his oldest child, and their relationship happened while both were at the center of Hollywood. More importantly, Quaid has publicly reflected on that relationship in ways that demonstrate it mattered deeply to him. Love does not always disappear when a marriage ends. Sometimes it changes, sometimes it becomes memory, sometimes it becomes regret, and sometimes it simply becomes part of who a person was. Chapter 8. The Affair. Question. One of the most controversial parts of Dennis Quaid and Meg Ryan's breakup involved infidelity. The public narrative surrounding their divorce became complicated, especially after Ryan's relationship with Russell Crowe became public. That period created enormous media attention. For many years, people looked at the breakup as a simple story: Hollywood marriage, famous actress, another man, divorce. But Quaid himself later suggested that the reality was much more complicated. He acknowledged that their marriage had problems before the relationship with Crow became public. That distinction matters, because celebrity relationships are often turned into neat stories for headlines, but marriages do not usually collapse because of one single moment. There are arguments, distance, unspoken resentment, changing ambitions, personal struggles, and sometimes two people simply stop being the same people they were when they first fell in love. That appears to have been part of the story of Dennis Quaid and Meg Ryan. Chapter 9. What happens when the love is gone? One of the hardest things about divorce is that love and separation can exist at the same time. A person can love someone and still know the relationship cannot continue. A marriage can fail without every memory becoming meaningless. And a former spouse can remain important without becoming a current partner. This is particularly true when children are involved. Dennis and Meg had Jack. Their relationship therefore never completely disappeared from their lives. Even after the divorce, they remained connected through their son. Jack Quaid eventually became an actor himself. And suddenly, the story came full circle. The son of two famous Hollywood actors entered the same world that had brought his parents together. But Jack was not simply a reminder of his parents' past. He became his own person. His success gave Dennis and Meg something else to share: pride in their son. Chapter 10. Dennis Quaid's Four Loves. Looking back at Dennis Quaid's life, it would be unfair to reduce everything to Meg Ryan. His first marriage was part of the young man he once was. His marriage to Meg represented another chapter. His relationship with Kimberly Buffington brought 2 children into his life. And his marriage to Laura Savoy represents the man he became later. 4 marriages, 4 different stories, 4 versions of Dennis Quaid, and perhaps that is what makes his romantic history so fascinating. People often want to know which wife was the greatest love, but human relationships cannot always be ranked like movies at the box office. One person may represent youth, another may represent family, another may represent a difficult lesson, another may represent peace later in life. Meg Ryan may have been one of the most publicly significant relationships Dennis Quaid ever had, but that does not erase the importance of the women who came before or after her. Chapter 11. The Love That Became a Memory. Years after their divorce, the story of Dennis Quaid and Meg Ryan changed. The anger and headlines gradually faded. The celebrity gossip disappeared. Their careers moved forward, their son grew up, and eventually they became something different from what they had been. They became part of each other's history. That can be more powerful than people realize, because the people who know us when we are young often remember a version of us that nobody else can completely see. Meg knew Dennis before his later marriages, before his later family life, before he became the older version of himself. And Dennis knew Meg during one of the most transformative periods of her career. That history cannot simply be deleted, but neither does it have to control the future. Chapter 12. 4 marriages, 1 extraordinary life today. Dennis Quaid remains active in entertainment. His career has survived changing Hollywood trends, changing audiences, and changing generations. He has played heroes and villains, fathers and athletes, romantic leads and complicated characters. And his personal life has been just as dramatic as some of the films he appeared in. 4 marriages, 3 children, decades of acting, multiple divorces, and 1 relationship that Hollywood still remembers. Meg Ryan. Was she the love of his life? Only Dennis Quaid can truly answer that question. And perhaps the more honest answer is not about choosing one woman over another. It is about recognizing that different people can occupy different places in a person's heart. Meg Ryan was unquestionably one of the defining relationships of Quaid's life. Their marriage produced his first child. Their careers were intertwined. Their breakup became a major Hollywood story, and decades later, people are still fascinated by what they meant to each other. But Dennis Quaid did not remain trapped in the past. He continued living, he continued working, he continued loving. He became a father again, he married again, and eventually, he found another relationship later in life. Maybe that is the real ending to the story. Not that Dennis Quaid secretly spent his entire life wishing he could return to Meg Ryan. Not that his other marriages were somehow meaningless. But that some people leave permanent fingerprints on our lives. Meg Ryan was one of those people for Dennis Quaid, and perhaps that is why their relationship still feels unfinished to the public, because Hollywood loves a perfect ending, but real life rarely gives us one. Sometimes the person you loved becomes your former spouse. Sometimes the marriage ends, but the memories remain. Sometimes the person you once shared everything with becomes someone you can only remember from a distance. And sometimes, after 4 marriages and decades of life, the past is no longer something you need to escape. It is simply part of your story. Dennis Quaid's story is not the story of one perfect romance. It is the story of a man who loved, lost, rebuilt, became a father, married again, and kept moving forward. And Meg Ryan will always be one of the most important chapters in that story. Not necessarily because she was the woman he loved more than everyone else, but because she was there during a moment in his life that could never happen again. They were young, they were famous, they were in love, they became parents, they built a life, and then, eventually, they lost it. Decades later, the world still remembers, but Dennis Quaid's life continued. And perhaps that is the most human part of the entire story, because sometimes the greatest love story isn't the one that lasts forever. Sometimes it is the one that changes you forever. And Meg Ryan may have been exactly that for Dennis Quaid.
Like and subscribe if you liked my video.